My name is Andy Milsted. I'm a director of Marlow Energy Group. I have volunteered to talk about carbon capture, use and storage tonight. Um, my background in this area, I am a chartered chemical engineer and chartered waste manager. I spent a reasonable amount of my career working on projects which involved absorption of carbon dioxide, both from biomethane processes and energy recovery power station processes. So I'm familiar a little bit with the processes we're talking about and the equipment required to do it, and have spent a fair amount of time, writing reports for clients who need to understand the implications of putting these processes into operation. So I've researched around the topic a little bit for tonight's talk in order to look at the background to this, what's happening in the globally as well as in the UK, and will present, a range of issues in addition to the core process technology. I hope at a level that a layman can understand. That picture is of a demonstration size carbon capture plant for interest, of the most used technology in this type. We'll go into that in some detail, in a little more detail. In researching the topic, I found there's a lot of information out on internet related to carbon capture, use and storage, but a lot of it has been put up by organizations with a vested interest. So it's actually quite difficult to pick your way through to the true story, as it were, in terms of where we are, what's happening, why, and so on. So with that in mind, I don't think tonight I'm trying to get into any of the politics related to, is this a good idea? Should it be supported? So on and so forth, but rather to look at the technical aspects of what's involved, where have we got to, and let you make up your minds as to whether you feel it's a good idea or not at the end of the day. What I intend to talk about at the moment is a little bit about the context, so that we're all on the same page, really, in terms of climate change. I'm assuming everybody recognizes CO2 as carbon dioxide and CO2e as carbon dioxide equivalent. So we'll talk about that in a little more, but I've used the shorthand CO2 throughout the talk. Can I also say that I've had various inputs, not only from my ex-colleagues in Rambol, who sent me one of their presentations to use, but also from various organizations who publish on internet. And I've used some of their diagrams and pictures in this presentation. Where possible, I have indicated who those are from so that they are acknowledged. So thanks to those organizations. First, what I'm going to do, we'll do a bit about the context. We'll go into carbon capture, and then it's the use bit of it and the storage bit of it. And then we'll have a quick look at where the UK has got to in terms of doing this. And then a little bit of a look at what we think is happening globally. And then finish up with what has to come next, and is there something that we can do about it to help the situation? So let's move on. Climate change, I think most of the people on this call probably understand climate change. We call it CO2 trapped in the atmosphere, causing temperature rise. It's also referred to as greenhouse gases, which is a mixture of gases which are usually represented as CO2 equivalent. Called the greenhouse effect. Global warming is one of the terms used to describe this. I prefer climate change myself. And as we came into the 2020s, the global emissions of carbon dioxide had reached 50 billion tons of CO2 per year and beyond. We'll look at those figures again because, again, depending where you look on internet, on various reports, you get slightly different figures defined in slightly different ways. The slides, I have to say, from Ramble, this is one of Ramble's because it says so on the bottom there, were from our Danish colleagues. So there's a little bit of Danglish has crept in, which I can't do anything about because they sent it to me as a PDF. So I've had to just take some of those, so excuse any odd spelling or different use of words. In terms of greenhouse gases, generally, there are a large portion of man-made greenhouse gases are coming from in the form of carbon dioxide, as we talked about, usually from burning fossil fuels. But there's also quite a high effect from methane produced by cows, but also by rotting vegetables, various other things. And actually, from oil reserves, there's some leakage of methane from natural gas systems. So there's quite a lot of methane, which has, in terms of tons, it's not much methane, but it has a big effect in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent. Nitrous oxide is formed whenever you burn any fuel because you're basically using air, which has a lot of nitrogen in it, and therefore it forms nitrous oxides of various kinds. And nitrous oxide, N2O, does have a significant climate change effect, greenhouse gas effect. And then there are the fluorine, the refrigerants. Various forms of refrigerant are out there. We've tried to move on from some ones which had a major effect on climate change, but some of those are still being emitted. And really small amounts of this kind of material does make a big difference to the load of greenhouse gases in the environment. So that's still a work in progress. Simplistically, my colleagues put forward this analogy of the bathtub with a tap running as the atmosphere being filled up with carbon dioxide. If the water runs over the edge, your home's going to be damaged. In order to prevent that, you have two options: pull the plug out or turn the tap off. I think the suggestion is that carbon capture, turning off the tap is preventing future emissions, but carbon capture is one of the technologies which might actually help you to drain the bathtub. Let's just pause a second because I came across some interesting information on internet, which is the kind of information that some of the climate deniers are using. So I thought it was worth, for our purposes, to understand where their arguments seem to be coming from. Whether we call it misinformation or not, I'm not sure. But basically, they look at the natural emissions of CO2 from forests, from volcanoes, from natural systems, from the sea. CO2 is going up all the time from rotting vegetation and so on, from animals, from us breathing, from animals breathing. So there's about 10 times. It's in the order of 450 billion tons of CO2 a year. Now, balance that against something in the order of 50 billion tons of man-made CO2. And their argument seems to be, why worry about what we're doing, the anthropogenic CO2, the man-made CO2, because it's dwarfed by the natural emissions. But what is happening naturally, particularly over the last 10,000 years and periods of stable climate, is that the amount of natural emissions being emitted are roughly balanced by the absorption of CO2 by the natural environment, by growing trees, by seas, and so on. So there is a balance in place. However, when the IPCC view, and most of the scientists in the world, their view is that by adding something like 10% extra carbon dioxide, we have upset that balance. And despite nature's ability to absorb some of that extra CO2, it's now having a dramatic effect on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is what actually increases the temperature. So I prefer to believe the 90% plus of the scientists in the world and IPCC, but that's been the call to actually try to reduce the amount we're emitting and possibly even absorb some of that from the atmosphere already. Looking at where it's coming from, I won't go into detail on this, but there are a lot of uses of fossil fuels and fertilizers and so on. By far the greatest is in production of electricity and heat. See at the bottom of that graph, the largest amount, which has increased significantly. These figures only go up to 21. It continues to increase through the next few years. I couldn't find a nice diagram, but transport is a big contributor. So is manufacturing and agriculture. Then we get down to the smaller issues like buildings, waste, aviation, and so on. So that takes us up. There was a dip you can see around about the time of COVID across the world. So everything sort of turned down a little bit. We can see that dip in the data, but it's gone up to 50 billion and over since then. So that's from Climate Watch, figures released in 24. What happens with projected greenhouse gas emissions in terms of future warning? Well, with current policies, which have been announced globally after the various COP meetings, we're probably on course to continue to increase temperature to 2.5 to 2.9 degrees C. There's a broad range there because it's not clear exactly how effective some of those policies will be. If we then look at the additional pledges and targets which have been set in different parts of the world, maybe we can get down to 2 degrees C or maybe even a little bit below, but our target has been 1.5. And you can see on the left of that graph, this sort of emission of the amount of CO2 which ends up every year in the atmosphere and how that relates to those various temperature rises. Carbon capture, this is the second part then to talk about carbon capture use or storage, depends how you want to say it. It's a means of preventing or removing CO2 from man-made emissions and storing it away, if you store it, storing it away so that it doesn't re-enter the atmosphere. Most of these man-made emissions are generated by the use and burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas, but there are other emissions related to chemicals manufacture and so on, cement manufacture. Cement is one of the big contributors, in fact. And when we look at this, there are various means of trying to eliminate or prevent those emissions. The key drivers we see are, in terms of the actual carbon capture mechanisms, relate to the capture rates, the availability, how reliable the equipment is in operation, whether it's technically or commercially proven, its health and safety. But all of these things really depend on some financial benefit being in place for people to build these plants. They cost money to build, they cost money to run. So unless there's some financial benefit in doing so, they will not get built and will not be operated. Carbon capture processes, there are a lot of them. We'll look at that, but I'm not going to look at all of them in detail, but they tend to be defined in four basic categories: post-combustion, pre-combustion, oxy-fuel, and industrial processes. So all of these things, produce carbon dioxide or more or less carbon dioxide. But by far the biggest emission of CO2 is post-combustion, and by far the biggest application of carbon capture is in the post-combustion process. I have to say, when I'm talking about this, industrial processes, depending on how you look at that, there are many industrial processes which have been in operation for a long time now, some time, let's say, which separate carbon dioxide from other materials. Most notably, let's take the example of natural gas. Natural gas quite often comes out of the ground with a high proportion of carbon dioxide in it. And there is a process which has been operated for a long time just to take that CO2 out of that gas so that when the remaining methane comes through the pipeline to your boiler, it burns properly and efficiently and so on, because the carbon dioxide isn't going to be of any use to you. But in most of those industrial processes, up to date, most of those processes separate the carbon dioxide and then just vent it into the atmosphere. So it's come from the natural gas, it's separated to condition the gas, and then it's vented out. Same is true in refineries and some chemical processes like plastics production and so on. Oxy-fuel is all about burning materials, coal, gas, or biomass with oxygen rather than in air. And that has potentially a beneficial effect in terms of having a higher portion of CO2 in the flue gas, making it easier to remove it. Pre-combustion is all about looking at the fuel you're using and again changing that fuel by chemical processes, steam, gas, pyrolysis of the fuel so that when it burns, it doesn't produce so much CO2. Quite expensive, but it does work in some cases and has worked for some time. You get companies like Air Products promoting that because they run these processes. But post-combustion is where most of the technology is being applied and is likely to be applied in the future. So, as I said, there are any number of processes which have been looked at, researched in universities. There are many chemical ways of taking carbon dioxide out of a gas in a gaseous state. There's some biological process, enzymatic processes, which could become significant in the future, but haven't yet got to the stage of development where they are being commercially applied. A lot of this comes down to the cost of running these processes. There are plastic membrane processes and cryogenic processes which do separate carbon dioxide, and membrane processes are used for conditioning natural gas, as I was describing before. You can put them through a membrane process which lets the methane pass and keeps the CO2 out and gets vented. Chilled ammonia, they've been playing around with that for a long time without it really getting much traction. So we're going to look at post-combustion, and post-combustion, the most common and the majority of processes we see at the moment are using a chemical called amine, which has the benefit of absorbing CO2, but also if you then heat up that absorbent, it absorbs CO2 at room temperature. If you heat it up to 50, 100 degrees, something like that, it will then let that CO2 go. So you can use that reversible reaction to take CO2 out of flue gas from an engine or a power station and direct the CO2 to some storage. So let's just have a look at that. I don't expect you all to suddenly become clever engineers, but it basically consists of two large columns with various pumps and heaters around them that you bubble. You can see on the bottom left of that column there's a flue gas inlet, so you can pump flue gas through a column of amine trickling down. It then gets taken to the liquid at the end is amine with CO2 in it. Clean flue gas, the rest of the flue gas, the nitrogen oxides and so on, will pass out of the top of the column and go back into the air. The amine with the CO2 in it goes into what they call a stripper column, where it's heated, and that drives off the carbon dioxide, which can then be compressed and liquefied to be used elsewhere or to go to storage. So this process doesn't determine whether it's used or stored, but it does require some heat to be applied. And actually, there's a fair amount of steam energy has to go into this process to make it work. Electricity to run the pumps and the compressors at the end. So there's a fair amount of energy as well as cost of the equipment that has to go into this to make it happen. There are health and safety challenges with this system. Amine is something you don't want to wash in, it needs to be handled carefully. It is the most mature carbon capture technology, but it does require these inputs of energy to make it work. There are several post-combustion cases operating at scale, and as I said earlier, it's a process which has been used in industry for separating carbon dioxide for a long time now. And it's commercially, everybody knows basically how much it costs to build and run, and so there's some confidence in building this thing and it doing its job. It's also best available technology compliant. That's a term in UK and European legislation that means that it's accepted as being reasonable practice. That's just a slightly more colourful chart of the same thing, but maybe it helps some people to understand that the little molecules of CO2 get into the amine, and then when it's heated up, they are driven off in a concentrated stream to storage. This one, care of Toshiba, Asia Pacific. Toshiba were also the people who built that demonstration plant we saw on the introductory slide. Some of the downsides, let's just briefly touch on that. It's a tailored process. Most of the amine solutions are chemically enhanced, let's say. They have additives which improve their performance in various ways and stop them being contaminated by minor constituents of flue gas. They tend to be pretty expensive, so you want to keep hold of those as much as possible. They can capture high percentages of the carbon dioxide in the flue gas. Some claim up to 99.5%, I think I've seen. But a safe level is in the 95% region you can get. They're usually proprietary. Every process design company worth its salt seems to have its own amine process. They design the facility itself, they give the guarantees, and they will supply the actual amine. So Toshiba, Shell, various others have processes which can be used by designers to make this happen. The flue gas itself, depending where it comes from, it could be very clean, but if, for instance, at worst case, you're putting it on the back of a coal-fired power station, you may have to make sure that you've removed the dust, sulfides, which are formed from coal, usually chlorides maybe as well. All those things will contaminate and cause problems in the amine process. So you have to put in filters, if you like, to remove those prior to the carbon dioxide absorption process. You also have to, flue gas usually in a power station is generated at quite a high temperature, 200 degrees C, depending on the after treatments you've put it through. And you really need to get it more or less down to ambient temperature to put it into carbon capture. So there's cooling involved to get the absorption and to protect the amine. And then, so it's consuming heat, it's consuming cooling water, there's electricity. We mentioned all of these things for compression. It can take, quite significant percentages. If you fit it on the back of a power station, you're probably losing something more than 10% of the power that that station can generate, because you're taking energy from the power station to provide the energy and heat that this process requires. You still do lose amine, and it has to be replaced. So it would be a waste that they have to get rid of, and it does need to be replaced to keep that process running. So there is some turnover of the amine, which is quite expensive. And to fit it on the back end of an existing power station or other process is not as efficient as designing a new power station, which is integrally designed with the carbon capture for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into, but you can optimize the two processes together to make sure you get, the least amount of loss of energy, if you like. And they're not small or cheap. These things do cost significant, tens of millions of pounds to build. They can be quite significant add-on portions to a power station or chemical process. Just to give you an idea of size, this is from How Stuff Works, the website. I found a picture of one of the few full-scale carbon dioxide carbon capture processes. The bit over here is I believe, the carbon capture process. And if you look at the cars and vehicles around the bottom, it's a big lump of metal. This inset picture has the power station. These are the power station itself with the 4 chimneys. And on the side there is the carbon capture unit. So you can imagine this thing is costing tens of millions of pounds. This one's actually in Saskatchewan in Canada and has been in operation since 2014, I understand. So it works. It does save, captures over 90%, and that is then stored underground in Canada. So it is operating at size in some places. Now we move on to what happens after you've captured the carbon. Now the first step should be to try and reuse it. So it can be used. It can be used to assist in oil field recovery. It's pumped into the oil reserves to help push out the last barrels of oil. So you can make efficient use of the well you've drilled. CO2 is quite important for crops and plants. Talking to growers up in north of London a few years ago, they were using CO2 to help grow their salad, peppers and tomatoes in glass houses up there. Cucumbers, they were adding 10% to the productivity of the glass house by putting several hundred ppm of CO2 into the glass house. So it does work. It's used in many products, as you all know, from beer to soft drinks, fire extinguishers, and also cement. Cement's quite a big, potentially a big user of CO2. But what's being pushed by a lot of the petrochemical companies this day is using the CO2 to actually combine with hydrogen in order to make useful products. So I think the next slide basically is a picture of that. So the idea being that you capture the carbon dioxide at source, you condition it, you use some renewable energy, which can come from panels, wind power, whatever, and that gives you some hydrogen. You could split water to get hydrogen, and by using the hydrogen with the carbon dioxide, you can then make a wide range of products with different catalysts, different processes. You can make things like methanol, dimethyl ether, industrial chemicals, if you like. You can make aviation fuel. You can make plastics. There are a wide range of products that can be made. How much it costs to make those is not quite as obvious in the marketing blurb at the moment. And that would be the determining factor on whether it's used for those kind of processes. So if you can't use the CO2, then it'll go to storage. And basically, storage is at the moment seen as placing it in the ground in geological structures underground, quite a long way down. And at the moment, I'm jumping ahead a bit, but we're in the UK, we're looking at using some of the used oil and gas reserves in the North Sea to introduce the CO2. One of the important things I want to point out in the slide is the ship in the middle. With that, you can do the carbon capture. That's proven and good. There's been a lot of research into pushing gases and things down into geological structures. That isn't such a big problem. I don't want to belittle it, but without some means of transport, of getting that compressed CO2 to the well, this whole system isn't going to work. We're not going to take CO2 out of the air. So storage, as I said, it can be used. Depleted oil and gas fields can be used. There's a lot of talk about using saline aquifers, preferentially, I think, confined aquifers. It can be dissolved in unconfined saline aquifers, but I think the first choice is likely to be in the UK, depleted fields or confined saline aquifers. It's worth saying that in most you would need a geologist to explain to you the details of this. I'm not a geologist, but my understanding is that if you put it in the right field, the carbon dioxide will actually mineralize, will react with the rock and solidify as carbonates, which will lock it away for millions of years. I don't think it's intended that the gas would stay as a gas in those deposits. But having said that, natural gas has been locked away for millions of years before the oil industry came and drilled holes into those structures to release it. So, even if it was a gas, as long as it's put in the right way, in the right place, it should stay there for geological periods of time. I made the point about transport of CO2. That's not a given. That still needs to happen, and it will cost quite a lot of money to set that up and to keep it running. And without that transport system, we won't finally remove this carbon from its emission sources. So there are challenges in carbon capture, a lot of immature technologies. It costs money to build and operate. At the moment, the regulatory framework across the world is, forming rather than mature. Inexistent, that's a Danglish word meaning non-existent. So at the moment, there aren't transport systems available for the CO2, so that needs to be developed. And the other major criticism of it is that it allows the fossil fuel industry to soldier on whilst trying to pretend that it's clearing up some of the problems related to it. So there's a political issue here. So what's happening in the UK? What are we doing here? You'll be pleased to know that as of 2013, the UK implemented European directives which require any combustion plant over 300 megawatts of electrical generating capacity to undertake a study to determine how it would fit a carbon capture unit on the back end if that became necessary. So it's supposed to look at reserving a plot of land next to the power station that's big enough to put it on, and also to nominally look at how that gas would be transported to a final place of storage. I have to say that The transport element of that is very basic. It's assumed that the carbon dioxide can be transported along the same corridors that natural gas is transported to many of these combustion plants. It's not a totally ridiculous assumption, because National Grid, who transport the gas, have a 10 or 15-meter wide way leave across the country for these pipelines, and therefore it would be possible to build another pipeline within that and those run back to North Sea terminals. So but it would cost a lot of money to do that. I was looking at a plant in London, and obviously to get from London back to Bacton and into the North Sea is many miles of pipeline, high pressure pipeline to transport carbon dioxide. So, it's not without its costs. The Large Combustion Directive also requires consideration of carbon capture, and the industrial emissions regulations also require that it's looked at, study options for CO2 retrofit, and potential pre-investment. So you're supposed to then do things within the design of your plant which make it easier to fit CO2 capture later on. And that's certainly true of the project I was working on. We looked at that quite carefully. But again, it's difficult to justify spending a lot of money when you don't know whether that's going to happen. Look at space, look at routes, and so on. I'm now going to switch in. The Department of Energy Security and Net Zero has produced a vision for CCUS in the UK. In fact, it was produced under the last government. So, one crumb of comfort is that both the current Labour government and the previous Conservative government wanted these kind of things to happen and were working towards it. This is a diagram from the net zero vision, and I'm not going to go into details. You can study at your leisure if you wish to, but basically it requires a cluster of facilities which are either generating carbon dioxide, absorbing it, compressing it, or taking it out of the air and pumping it into reserves under the sea. It also links in renewable energy, which might be used to produce hydrogen, which could then be reacted with carbon dioxide for reuse as other materials. So it requires a big system to come together with a lot of pipes to make it all work. But let's just look. There was the ministerial forward to the 2023 thing. So it's a game changer for the UK. They're saying there's 78 billion tons of capacity to store CO2 under the seabed. It's large by world standards, which is true. And they feel that it's important to generate this business, which requires government intervention. And this is perhaps where mechanisms and processes have to be set up that allow a company to come along, spend a lot of money on laying carbon dioxide piping in place, and know that they're going to get paid in the future for that expenditure of money. So if you're going to do it in a capitalist sort of system, you need to see that there's a business case to put this infrastructure into the ground, as it were. The same study looked at the situation. These bubbles that you see on the right-hand side here show you, the saline aquifers by size. They're not physically that size. This is just a key indicating which are the bigger saline aquifers. The empty circles are unconfined. The green ones are closed, and also the dots are the depleted hydrocarbon fields, oil or gas. And the size of the dot or circle gives you an idea of metric tons of CO2 that can be absorbed. I think it's worth noting there's a lot off the east coast here. There's a lot, as you'd expect, off of Aberdeen in the North Sea, but there's also some in the Irish Sea off of Liverpool and the Northwest. So moving on. And what they did in defining this vision was to set out a number of industrial clusters, these stars, which would be defined, and some attempt made to get these up and going in terms of businesses, in terms of different locations in Middlesbrough, Teesside, the East Coast cluster. These two kind of go together because they're feeding into the same fields. The Northwest, there's the HyNet cluster in the Merseyside region, and then around Aberdeen, the same, another cluster up there. You'll notice that big areas of the UK are not included. London, the Midlands, other industrial areas are not so far included because they're seen as being too far at the moment from these clusters until these clusters have started work, as it were. Here's again a vision of what would happen at Teesside in the East Coast cluster. And I put this up just to indicate that there are a number of different companies and potential developments in terms of hydrogen production, hydrocarbon, hydrogen production by Kelias and BOC, the energy from waste plants, there's power station, nitrogen fertilizer plants, there's the net zero power, which is a power station with carbon dioxide. Obviously, some of these are further advanced than others, blue hydrogen, BP. So this whole area was very industrialized and has been for 50 to 100 years. So many of these facilities are being built on land which has been chemical process land for many years. Seal Sands is a big petrochemical area in Middlesbrough. But the benefit of this system is that these things are relatively close together, and therefore interconnecting pipe work and transport of materials is relatively low cost. That was Middlesbrough, Grimsby, Hull, Teesside area, sorry, Tyneside area is also linked into the same endurance fields in terms of storage. So UK government, wherever they got to with this, they passed the Energy Act in 23, which gave them powers to start setting up companies and writing contracts for various these actors in that process, and to try and allow them to do whatever actions they need to do to get some of that transport infrastructure in place. And this government, the Labour government, at the end of last year, announced, Ed Miliband, I think, got the pleasure of announcing 21 billion in funding for the first CCUS projects, which would basically be the East Coast cluster, which we just looked at, and the net zero Teesside cluster, and then HyNet in the northwest of the country. So those things, they are trying to get off the ground and moving with the help of various industrial entities. Let's just have a quick look at global issues before we finish, so try not to keep you too long. I thought you'd be interested to see what's happening globally. There is an outfit out there called the Global CCS Institute. Its job is to promote and help different countries to adopt carbon capture and make the technology available to them. So obviously it has a particular viewpoint in terms of promoting the technology. But you'll see that between 23 and 24, there has been some increase in operating facilities. A small amount of operating facilities, the dark blue, have improved the volume of carbon dioxide capture has slightly improved. And you've also got many more plants now in 24 in construction, and more capacity in construction, and many more processes being looked at. This is the light blue is the early development, which means people have done feasibility studies and so on. The advanced development is quite a detailed engineering design, which costs quite a lot of money. So you don't do that unless you're pretty serious at getting that plant built. The in construction means a contract has been signed to deliver this facility. So it isn't bad news. Here's the what's happened over the last 14 years to 24, and you can see there was a dip. Although the operating plants seem to keep going, seemed to be a dip in interest in developing things around about 2017, but that's built up since. And things seem to be moving along quite well. I have to say this stopped before Trump came into power, so we'll see how that works next year. But obviously, you have to get into construction before you start operating. And so we would hope within, usually it takes a year or two to build one of these plants. You'd hope that operating capacity increase fairly dramatically in the next year. They put together this chart as well, which is complicated. It does separate the carbon capture by the industry sector, as it were, from direct air capture at the top here, through power generation, hydrogen and ammonia fertilizer plants, natural gas processing. So different types of facility, and where these facilities are having carbon capture added to them. Excuse me. Of what size? The size of the dot, again, is the capacity we're talking about, with the big dot being 5 million tons of CO2 per annum, small dot being 200,000 tons of CO2. I mean, they are tiny dots for direct air capture. For instance, the Iceland project, which most of you will have looked at some point, is proposed to collect about 30,000 metric tons of carbon per year at the moment. So that's the name escapes me at the moment, but the new one that they've got, 30,000 tons, is small compared to some of these big industrial facilities which capture carbon, if you like, on the tailpipe of an industrial process. And these at the bottom of the transport and storage projects. You can see this is lagging behind by a few years. These plants, like the Saskatchewan power plant we looked at, have storage underneath them pretty much. So they are built in areas where there's readily available storage for CO2, but where it has to be transported some distance, that storage facility and the transport system is lagging. And this is what they reckon the top 5 countries in CCS projects were going to do in 24. 23 is the light blue and 24 is the dark blue color. You see the United States is actually, was in 24 going to be the largest builder of carbon capture projects across the planet. I think that's probably as a result of the Democrat bills to develop environmental facilities of various kinds. Again, I would expect that to drop somewhat in 25 after the new administration has come in, but we'll see. UK is a big contender. We have a number of projects coming up. So is Canada. They produce a lot of gas and oil there, and those facilities there are increasingly having captured carbon. And Norway and China, interestingly. So China is actually also doing a fair amount and comes up in the top 5 countries worldwide. However, they've also recently built several, in fact, many coal-fired power stations. So they do need to think about their emissions and do more. So, final conclusions then. What happens next? CO2 lasts in the atmosphere for around 100 years. So when you say CO2 equivalent, it goes up there. Every kilogram that goes up there is basically going to be there warming the planet for 100 years, unless we take it out of the atmosphere. So the important lesson to take away there, that's 2 or 3 generations. So the sooner we stop each kilogram being released, the better, because it's going to be with us a long time. Even if we take the optimistic view that all of the projects which were in that last bit of global data proposed for looking at early stages of development and in design are actually set into operation, that's still roughly probably less than 1% of the current fossil fuel CO2 emissions across the globe. So, it's not going to make a huge dent unless a lot more carbon capture is done. Obviously, without reducing those emissions, we're going to find it very, very difficult to catch up. The other thing to take away, without the incentives to build and operate the plants, they're not going to be realized. They're not going to be built. They're not going to be operated. They cost money. So there needs to be mechanisms agreed throughout the globe to make these things happen. Each country has to set its own regulations. The one that everybody's hanging their bets on at the moment is some form of carbon tax, so that different facilities would be taxed for using fuel, burning fuel, and that money would basically be used to fund. It's not quite that. It's indirect, but by doing that, they would, if they build a carbon capture facility, they don't have to pay so much tax. So, they may get to a point where the tax basically pays for the construction and operation, the financing of carbon capture and storage. That's the idea. Europe and the UK have moved along that path. I'm not quite clear how far the US and Asia have got with that, but it's part of the COP discussions, which happen on an annual basis. So we said CCS alone is not going to solve the climate crisis. And we're likely to have to look at many of the processes and tools which are currently being developed, to manage the climate before we can deal with climate change in a sensible way. This is carbon capture, use and storage is one of the tools, one of the set of tools. And I guess my view is we probably need access to it as part of the toolkit for managing the climate crisis. But, there are many other things, particularly reduction in emissions, which has to happen to make it work. And I think there's a long way to go in terms of the regulatory, legal, and technical work that needs to be done before it's all going to be happening at scale globally. And just to bring us back to ourselves for a minute before we leave, what can we do? Say, I don't want everybody to despair. We can do what we're trying to do in Meg already, which is, help people understand about what they can do themselves in their house, insulation, travel, diet, to make choices which reduces their carbon emission. But I think importantly, we can talk to friends, other people around Marlow, neighbours, and maybe challenge them a little bit if they don't believe that this is happening and it's a problem. We can help by using social media to spread the word. I think there's some theory that if 10% or more of the people form an opinion in one way, then that's enough possibly to tip the balance. We need to get a number of people believing in this and feeling it's important. I believe most people talk to their neighbours and family before they form opinions. on what they're going to do about anything, voting or reducing their carbon footprint. But we need to make sure that that's working in favour of some action on this. So we can also lobby politicians and keep the pressure on not just the Green Party, who maybe are there already, but also, perhaps lobbying parties which are speaking out against climate change and net zero at the moment, to try and persuade their politicians that they're not going to get voted in unless they come up with a sensible policy. We need, I mean, it's encouraging that the Conservatives and Labour Party seem to be on the same side of the fence, more or less, although they'll argue about how they get on with it and how much it costs. But at least they seem to be heading in the same direction, or were until the last election, at least. But I think we should challenge unhelpful views, but maybe by nudging rather than getting into war with people, because that is not going to help in the end. But we need to keep it at the top of the agenda. There are a lot of other things, conflicting wars, problems, economy. We need to keep this as an election issue in order to get change and to sustain whatever change is likely to happen. I think, I was at a discussion last night where we actually, we're looking at what happened with solar and wind power. We know that they've become cheaper, and the European and the UK incentives, which went into the early days of establishing a market in solar panels, incentives to put them on your roof, incentives to build solar power stations and wind power in the North Sea. All of those things have helped to establish the supply lines, the manufacturing processes, the factories, be they in China, Europe, or wherever, that actually allow these things to be deployed. They're being deployed in the UK. The costs of these things have come down so that it's now cheaper to use solar and wind power than it is to build gas-fired power stations, for instance. So we know that, by leading, we can help the rest of the world to demonstrate that it works, that it's worth doing. And I think I was quite impressed with Arnold Schwarzenegger the other day. Saw him being interviewed. He was basically saying, don't worry about the president of the United States, what he thinks. You just got to get on with it. Don't moan about that all the time. Just get on with what you're doing. And I think there's probably a lot of truth in that. So, anybody still awake? Any questions?
No, that was great.
Alwyn?
I have to say, oh, sorry, Olwen jumped in front. I'm going to go because a lot of it went over my head. I'm not a chemist, but
I'm sorry if that's the case. We
oh,
tried to make it a
no,
little bit
no, it's sort of,
digestible.
you absorb the sort of general feeling of it. It was great. Thank you. I learnt a lot. It's not the chemistry.
No, okay.
I'll leave it to the discussion with
The
Olwen.
chemistry gets more complicated than I can handle as well.
Brilliant. No, thanks.
Thanks. One query I had, you said during it, you had your capture of your carbon dioxide, and then the next slide was about then use of it. And in my head, I'm thinking, well, if you use it for some of these things, that's not actually locking it up at all. That's just temporarily putting it somewhere and then basically putting it back in the air again.
That's true.
And it would seem to me that instead of sort of saying, well, we can use it, and then if we don't use it, we can store it, it is more, well, we shouldn't be using it unless there's a very good reason that item hasn't been able to be, that otherwise we would need to burn more fuel in order to do that thing. It just seems to me it should be the other way around.
Let me try and tackle that in this way. We put carbon dioxide in beer, we put it in drinks and so on. We produce that carbon dioxide in order to feed it into those drinks. So if you could take your captured carbon dioxide and use it in those processes, you're saving that production of the extra carbon dioxide. So I would argue that that's still a saving overall. Some of the processes you use it on do lock it up. If you put carbon dioxide into cement as part of your process, it is locked up in the cement.
Mm.
The same if you use carbon dioxide to get the last few barrels of oil out of an oil field, you have stored that carbon dioxide underneath the sea. So I think you'd have to look at the use cases individually to decide whether they were taking carbon back into the air. Certainly, fizzy drinks release it at the end of the day, but it is stopping you producing it otherwise. So I think it's an interesting point, but you know, there are various answers depending on use. And certainly in the glass houses that I was talking to the guys in the Lee Valley, they were burning natural gas in order to produce carbon dioxide in their glass houses to generate growth.
And then the gas was just escaping, presumably. I mean, it's
It
those
went out of the vent at the end of the day when,
those are things that they need to be, you know, changed so they don't then release the stuff.
Yeah, I was talking to them about taking carbon dioxide from an energy recovery facility, but we never got that far. It looked as though it might work for a while, but then it didn't occur.
So it just seems like, you know, you tackle your it's like redirection rather than saying, well, we need to stop the emission from this development. We need to get them to recycle their carbon dioxide and absolutely top it up as and when, but basically not let it vent. It's that kind of feeling of it's not being all added up. It's like, oh, we've captured it. Great. What can we do with it? Oh, we can use that.
The main process which the lobbying groups, you know, the fossil fuel lobbying groups are trying to push at the moment seems to be the use of carbon dioxide as with green hydrogen to form various products which we currently make from oil. So, you know, maybe there's an argument to be had there if it works out. It all, as I said at the time, it depends on the cost of doing it that way because, you know, we work in a capitalist society, and if it's an unreasonable or unfinanceable project, it's not going to happen, basically.
I understand. It's just like you think of a carbon tax and you think, well, you're going to be funding to set these things up. But really, you have to make sure that the thing is being put into the right route subsequently. But I get exactly.
Yes, and that's part. Yeah, that's part of what we as the public ought to be pursuing and making sure happens in as much as we can. You know, making sure our politicians like yourself understand this and you know, act in the right way in terms of passing regulations and trying to get these businesses moving.